Hi, I'm Jason Leahy, Executive Director of the Illinois Principals Association, and welcome to another edition of IPA Talk, where we talk about key issues happening in the profession, as well as things going on with the association. And with me, for this edition of IPA Talk, Brian Schwartz, General Counsel, Deputy Director of IPA, as well as Alison Maley, Government Public Relations Director for the Illinois Principals Association. And the purpose for this edition of IPA Talk is to discuss SB 100. So we've been at this a bit now in schools, with the effective date happening September 15th, but knowing that it really got started with the start of the school year. So we've had some questions. People have raised some other concerns or just some clarity that they're looking for with the bill, and you guys have received those, done some investigation with that, and so I think it's important that we discuss this. And Brian, just right off the start here, any general remarks with regards to SB 100 at this point in time from your perspective that maybe we can get things started with?
I think we're getting used to Senate Bill 100, and from the questions that we're getting at the IPA office, I'm encouraged that school administrators are looking at the true intent of Senate Bill 100 and looking at the real individual needs of kids and trying to meet those needs in terms of student discipline. So I think we're on the right track, and I have no doubt that will continue. We'll certainly have some kinks to work out, but so far I think it's encouraging. And I think it's something that everyone's going to be able to live with in the long run.
Great. Well, and hopefully, ultimately, we do what's best for our students with this. And it's even challenged me in some of my thinking with that. So I think that's important. So we received some questions from individuals, things that they're interested. I know that you put out a message on IPA Connect asking for people to provide some feedback. And the questions, we've really broken these up into two different types of questions: behavior interventions and then appropriate and available support services that schools need to consider. So let's dig on the intervention side first. And so, Alison, unfortunately, I don't know who the reader is that submitted these, but we'll put it out there anyway. I'm going to start with you. The first one is, are schools required to exhaust all behavioral interventions prior to an exclusionary removal?
Yeah, so for long-term suspensions, so 4 to 10 days, expulsions, and removals to alternative schools are required to exhaust all appropriate and available behavioral interventions. However, depending on the gravity of the situation, there may not be any interventions that are appropriate for that situation. I think we've talked about situations where kids bring weapons to school or drugs. There may be no interventions that are appropriate for those situations, but otherwise, yes.
Okay, that's good to know, and I think that's important that people take a look at their entire discipline plan, everything that they have involved, and make sure that they're doing what's necessary.
And I might mention that I think a lot of schools are looking at a short-term suspension, a 1 to 3 day suspension, because there's a lower legal threshold. You don't have to show that you've exhausted those available and appropriate interventions, behavioral interventions prior to the discipline.
Very good. Second one, Brian, this one's for you. How does SB 100 apply to students with an IEP?
And that's a very good question. It's important to remember that Senate Bill 100 and the IDEA apply separately and together. So we really have to make sure that we're following the requirements of Senate Bill 100 and the requirements of IDEA. And that with the child with disabilities on the front end, in terms of whether or not we've exhausted appropriate and available behavioral interventions, oftentimes we know for a kid with an IEP what those appropriate and available interventions are. And I think there's a real enhanced obligation on the part of school officials to make sure that we've got those right, because I could potentially see a parent challenging us, saying that the interventions that were put in place with the IEP process weren't appropriate. So it's an extra step, an extra obligation on behalf of the school district.
Very good. Last question with regards to behavioral interventions. Alison, does SB 100 apply to in-school suspensions as well?
It does not. So it doesn't say anything about in-school suspensions, and I think a lot of schools are sort of looking at that as an alternative to keeping kids in the building, in school, and also serving some kind of a consequence for their actions. Some districts have decided that it's appropriate to have a licensed teacher in those situations, but I think everyone should consult with their school district policies to make sure that that's appropriate.
Yeah, very good. And I think it's very critical for building leaders to make sure that they're on these more precarious issues and the tougher issues. or communicating with superintendents and school boards and making sure everybody's on the same page with that. That's just good practice with that. All right, so we're going to pivot here away from behavior interventions and start talking about appropriate and available support services. Brian, I want to start with you with this. What does the term appropriate and available support services actually mean?
What we're looking at here is we're looking at services that schools make available to kids while they're suspended. And those can be anything from behavioral support services to educational support services to counseling to anything else that might be appropriate and available under the circumstances. I think what's important here that school administrators have to remember, though, is they don't have to create something that doesn't exist. These are services that are appropriate under the circumstances and available within constraints of the school budget and resources.
Very good. So, Alison, does a school need to provide support services to students during an out-of-school suspension?
Yes. So if there's a suspension longer than 4 days, and that's kind of the threshold, available support services are required. But again, the school district doesn't have to create things that don't exist already. Again, depending on the severity of the actions, they may not be appropriate and they may not be available within that district.
Right. Well, and I think this goes back to making sure principals are documenting every circumstance fully, just to make sure that they are handling the discipline appropriately and making sure that students receive the support services that they need.
And just to elaborate on Alison's point, districts aren't required to create anything that doesn't otherwise exist. But what is important is that you document on the short-term or the long-term suspension form, whichever is appropriate, that the school district, within the constraints of their resources and their budget, don't have those services available to kids during a long-term suspension.
So what about an expulsion situation?
No. So districts are encouraged and may refer students to available support services, perhaps within the community, but they're not required to provide those either.
Right, right. Brian, this is just a question that comes to mind for me as I think about things that I used to do when I was a building principal. And prior to that point of going to an expulsion, we might look at an alternative placement for a student and use that as kind of a stopgap measure before going to an expulsion, work up a contract with the student and include the parents through all of that and give them just one more opportunity. I mean, do you see that it's appropriate? That's a methodology I used many years ago as a principal. Would that be appropriate, with SB 100 now?
Absolutely. And when kids engage in behavior that's considered expellable, what we often do is we often hold the expulsion hearing, let the child, his parents present evidence, let the school board make the decision that the child's expulsion eligible, but we put that in abeyance and send the child to the alternative school. That is still absolutely appropriate under Senate Bill 100. The thing to remember, though, is the Senate Bill 100 requirements do apply to disciplinary transfers to alternative schools.
Okay, so let's take this back. I asked you before about students with IEPs. Let's look at that with regards to support services that are available. So are students with an IEP entitled to support services during their suspension? How does that work with these kids?
Right, and I think what's important to remember with kids with an IEP is that once we get past our 10 days of taking a kid outside of their special education placement, we're going to have to provide services one way or the other. So what we're looking at here is within that first 10 days of removing a child from their placement. So maybe a 4-day suspension, 1 month, followed by a 5-day suspension, another month. Are these kids for the removals over 4 days, so it'd be 5 to 10 days, do we have to provide appropriate and available support services? With a child with an IEP, we already know it's appropriate because that's going to be in their IEP. And the decision that school administrators are going to have to make is, again, within the constraints of budget and resources, are those services available to the child during the removal?
It almost seems to me, students with IEPs, it brings clarity to how to work with those kids with these discipline situations, even more so sometimes than even a regular ed student, just because that IEP lays things out pretty clearly, or at least it should, correct?
Sure. It's a benefit that we have with kids with IEPs, with 504 plans, because we know those kids' needs ahead of time, and that helps us both on the front end in trying to prevent disciplinary situations, but also on the back end then dealing with those disciplinary situations.
Very good. Very good. Last question that we received here, Allison. What do schools need to do when a student returns from a suspension or expulsion?
Sure. So districts have to create re-engagement policies, and it's just a matter of kind of coming together with the families, the parents, guardians, and that child to figure out how are we best going to help serve you and how are we going to help you be successful once you do return to school. It doesn't have to be anything formal, just a kind of a sit down with the family and the student to figure out what they're going to do next. And then also students that are suspended have an opportunity to create their makeup work at equivalent credit as well.
Okay, very good. So we've created here at the association a variety of resources for people. We've set up some blogs and information. We know that people are dialoguing a bit about it on IPA Connect, and we're receiving questions here. Most people probably are already aware of this, Brian, but I think it bears mentioning as we're talking about SB 100 is that this legislation required quite an overhaul of the Model Student Handbook, and you were engaged in that, and I know we're continuing to tweak that. We're about to put out some new updates here pretty soon, and I think it's worth noting that this recording is November 1st of 2016, just to give it a bit of a timestamp to help comply with some of the ESSA changes and things. But you are looking at SB 100 as part of this as well. But for those that maybe aren't familiar with the Model Student Handbook, Brian, could you just give us a 30-second to 60-second quick overview of what's available to support SB 100 implementation in the Model Student Handbook?
Sure. Well, we have all of the handbook procedures relevant to Senate Bill 100. And what's important is that they will also match model school board policy. So when school boards, as most all of them do, use the press service put out by the Illinois Association of School Boards, our handbook procedures will match that. I think the most important thing probably in our model student handbook is our short-term and long-term student discipline forms, which really lay out a template to make sure that administrators are taking into consideration all of the pertinent facts, making sure that each child is looked at through a separate lens and an individual lens with student discipline, but probably most importantly, making sure that all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed in terms of documentation.
Very good. Appreciate that. Well, thanks for taking a little bit of time to watch this edition of IPA Talk. We're focused primarily on SB 100. Appreciate Brian Schwartz, Alison Maley joining me for that. As always, if there's anything the association can do for you, never hesitate to give us a call. And you can always find us on the web at www.ilprinciples.org. Take care.